Apology for starting the adult forum a little bit late because our worship went late as well. So, but thank you for being here with us. And our adult forum this Sunday, we have Austen Hartke, who will be talking about gender pronunciation and how that relates to theology. And it's also sharing about his also journey. And he has a wonderful book as well. I have his book, but so this is Austen Hartke, so please give a round of applause. And Austen, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Esther.
Oh, I'm sorry. We may stop about 11:45. Is that okay?
Cool. That's great with me. Yeah. I'm going to take my mask off, so is that all right? All right, cool. Well, good morning, everybody. Thanks for having me here. I'm so excited to be here. Oh, good. I should wait for the good morning. Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
There we go. All right. Forget, sometimes, I speak in a lot of different churches all over the place, and there are some churches that are like ready. They're ready to say good morning back to you, and other churches are just dead silence. Got to give you the benefit of the doubt. Thank you so much to Esther for inviting me today. I'm excited to be here. So my name is Austen Hartke, as Esther said. I am a transgender guy. I am a theologian and a writer and a community organizer, and I do a whole bunch of different things. I'm here today to talk to you a little bit about, I'm going to start out kind of walking you through some of the questions that I was asking as I was coming to understand my gender, and kind of walk you through a few of the basics around gender. We're going to touch like so briefly on the Bible, because that's my favorite thing to talk about. And we're going to talk about pronouns, and we're going to talk about having trans and gender expansive youth and adults in our congregations, and things that we can do to help welcome them and help affirm them and make sure they know they're part of our community. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. I know that the text that is going to be on the screen is going to be small, and so you're going to be like, I can't see. So if you want copies of these slides after the session today, I can either give you my email address, or we can email them to Esther, we can email them to the tech team over here. So if you want the slides afterwards, you can get them. So don't fret if you can't read it right away. You will have them later. So, we're going to start out, I'm going to share a little bit about my story in growing up. So I'm going to start out with this adorable picture of me and my sisters. This is me and my two sisters. I'm the oldest of three. I am the one on the far left there. So when I was born, I was assigned female at birth, meaning that when I was born, the doctor said, congratulations, it's a girl. And then it took me about 24 years to be like, psych, you're wrong. To figure out who I was and to be able to find the language to explain that to other people. So for the first part of my life, everybody treated me like I was the oldest of three girls. I grew up in a non-denominational evangelical sort of family, homeschooling family, so we were pretty theologically conservative. And for me, growing up, my experience of gender and faith there was sort of the person that you were expected to be at church and in religious circles, and then there was the person that my mom kind of like allowed a little bit more wiggle room for. So when we were at church, there were very specific things about like men do this and women do this, and like, depending on what your gender was, this is what you were allowed to do, this is how you were supposed to dress. At home, my mom allowed a little bit more wiggle room. She always used to say, your grandma was a tomboy when she was younger, and I was kind of a tomboy growing up. You'll grow out of it. You'll grow out of it. And so this was me at age 10 with my nice little bowl cut playing baseball. And when I look back at this photo of me, I go, oh yeah, I can recognize myself in that. I can go, yep, that looks like me. So this was kind of the kid that my mom was like, you're a tomboy, but you'll grow out of it. And for me, growing up, I never felt a very strong sense of my gender either way. I didn't feel especially boy-like or especially girl-like. I just knew that I hated wearing dresses, and I knew that when people mistook me for a boy, because I was running around with this bowl cut, I felt like proud and excited and happy. I didn't know why, I just knew like, this feels right, this feels good. So by the time I was a teenager, I had to kind of figure out how to get along with other teenagers, because in middle school especially, there's a lot of pressure to like look like everybody else and do what everybody else is doing. And so in middle school and early high school, I was like, okay, I'm gonna grow out my hair, I'm gonna try to dress in a more feminine way to try to just like get away from being like bullied by the other kids. And I tried that. It didn't work out that well for me. It just felt wrong all the time. I felt like I never could quite figure out what I was supposed to be doing. This is a photo of me, pretty blurry photo there from a nice old camera, in early high school. And one of the things I realized, if you can't see this photo very well, I've got dyed black hair and I've got black nail polish on. One of the things I figured out in high school was that if you are part of a sort of subgroup, there's sometimes some more wiggle room in terms of gender expression. So I found all the goth kids at my high school, and I was like, ooh, all the goth kids, okay, I can do this because they're in sort of the like goth circles in my high school. The boys would paint their nails black. It was like a thing that they would do, and it was kind of like this punky thing. And to me, I was like, oh, okay. I can paint my nails, which people around me will think like, good job, you're doing a girl thing, but I can paint them black, which nobody will know is secretly me doing a boy thing. So I would find these ways to like get around the gender expectations that were sort of set up for me. So by the time I was in high school, I was realizing that my faith was changing. Because what I was starting to see was, I was starting to meet people who were different from me. People who had a different religious background, people who weren't Christian for the first time. I was like, there are people who aren't Christian? This is not something I'd expected. I grew up in a very small town. So I met people who weren't Christian. I met gay and lesbian folks who I had never really met before, and was like, oh, this is a new thing to me. And I was told growing up that these people were bad and evil. So how do I deal with this? These seem like very nice people to me. And I started thinking more critically about my faith, trying to figure out what was going on here. And it started rankling more and more that this faith that I had been taught about growing up, that said God loves everybody, that God created human beings in God's image, and that we are these sort of wonderful things, that we are supposed to love our neighbor. All of that was what I was taught, but at the same time I was taught, if you are not Christian, if you are gay or lesbian, if you are, if you do this, this, and this, and this, God is angry at you and you're going to hell. And like, how do I reconcile these things? And it started to really sort of get under my skin. And I started to think, you know what? Maybe Christianity isn't for me. Like, maybe this is something that I grew up with, but I don't actually believe. Maybe this is not something that feels, if I see Christians treating people terribly, why would I want to be part of that? Was kind of what I was wrestling with as a teenager, right? So I kind of moved away from Christianity as a teenager, and I still had this like deep desire to understand God and to investigate faith, but I wasn't sure that Christianity was the way to do that anymore. So I did a lot of kind of searching through college. Toward the end of college, I started thinking, you know what, maybe there are ways to understand these things within Christianity, because I'd only ever experienced one specific kind of Christianity, and I didn't really know there were more kinds out there. So I ended up going to a Lutheran church, which is how the Lutherans got stuck with me. I started going to this ELCA church because a friend of mine invited me, who I had a crush on, and because I had a crush on her, I was like, well, yeah, of course I'll go. And I followed her to church, and it was the first church that I'd been in that didn't say terrible things about gay and lesbian folks. They didn't say anything positive either, they just didn't say anything negative, and for me, that was like a huge jump. And I thought, okay, well, hang on, maybe there's something that like it might be okay in this space. And so I started meeting with the pastor, and I would go and bother him all the time and be like, explain this part of scripture to me, this part of the Bible, I was raised thinking it meant this, so like, what do you do with it? And I started having this like really nice relationship with this church. And they really embraced me as this kid that was like coming to church all by themselves as like, a teenager and a young adult. And I started realizing that there was so much more within Christianity that I had never known about or never been able to explore. So many things I wanted to question. So of course, I thought, I'll go to seminary. They have all the answers in seminary. If you've been to seminary, you know they don't have all the answers. But they do teach you to ask good questions. So I ended up going to seminary, and while I was over at Luther Sem here, I started being able to, it was sort of a combination of being able to and being sort of internally forced to confront my experience and my feelings about gender. Because if you are in a position where you're trying to be sort of open and honest with the people around you, you're trying to have this like vulnerable, authentic relationship with others and with God, and then you realize that you've sort of built up these masks to wear so that people can't see who you really are because you're afraid if they do see who you really are, they won't want to be around you anymore, they'll kick you out, whatever. And I realized I was holding on to all these masks. I had these walls built up around me. And realizing that I had to let go and take down some of those walls to be seen for who I really was if I wanted to be in real relationship with others and with God. But that was really scary, right? So this is a picture of me and my girlfriend several years ago. 10 years ago now we've been together. So this is a picture of me and my girlfriend 10 years ago when I was first like, okay, I'm going to cut my hair real short, I'm going to start dressing in the way that I want to dress, I'm going to just be me, and we'll just kind of see how that goes, see how people respond to that. Overall, my friends responded really well. I was out as trans to a couple of people in seminary, and they were really supportive. It was more complicated with like seminary as an institution. So I ended up not coming out as trans until after I graduated. They sort of handed me my diploma and I said congratulations. Then a couple days later I was like, surprise, I'm trans. So this is me getting my degree over from Luther. And it turned out fine. Luther has been great about it. But at the time, there had been no trans people that had graduated from Luther ever before. And I was the first one, and I was like, oh, we'll see how this goes. Will they stop, will they give me my diploma or not? My background while I was at Luther was in Old Testament or Hebrew Bible studies. And the whole reason I went into that field of study was because I was always told that sort of we had this like angry Old Testament God and loving New Testament God, right? And the angry Old Testament God was the one who was all like, you can't be gay and you can't wear, things. So like, I thought to myself, there's gotta be more to it than that. Like, it's gotta be more to it than that. And it helped too that my girlfriend is Jewish. And her Jewish community was more affirming of transgender people than my Christian communities were. And I was like, now hang on. If you've got, all you've got is angry Old Testament God, how do you work this out? So I ended up doing a lot of research into Scripture, and that has been one of my favorite things, and continues to be one of my favorite things to talk about, is gender diversity within Scripture. So today, this is just a photo of me before preaching over at, that was at St. Mark's, I think, in Minneapolis. Today, a lot of what I do is I go around and I talk to churches about gender diversity, and I talk to churches about trans folks in our communities. And I really love doing that. The other part of my job is I run an organization called Transmission Ministry Collective, which is a support organization for trans Christians, and it's all online. So we run support groups and Bible studies, and we have chat groups and all kinds of stuff. And we have folks from all over the country, and even folks from outside the US, who join in and talk about what it's like to be a trans Christian. There are tons of us out there, which you might not think about or know if you didn't know somebody who is connected to the community. So that's a little bit about my story. I'm going to talk about 3 big questions that I was like working through as I was kind of working through my young adulthood here. So my 3 big questions I was asking were, what does it mean to be transgender? What does the Bible say? And will I be able to find a faith community? Those were 3 big questions that I had. So let's talk about this first question here. What does it mean to be transgender? I'm kind of starting from zero here, assuming that you know nothing. So if you do know about, words like transgender and what it means, awesome, bear with me. If you don't, hopefully this won't be too confusing to start out. There are lots of different ways to understand gender. We have lots of different models, and depending on what kind of background you come from, you might understand gender in a different way. For instance, if you are an evolutionary biologist, you're going to have one idea about what gender is. If you are a psychologist, you're going to have an idea about what gender is. If you're like an anthropologist studying cultures, you're going to have a different idea of what gender is. So this is a model that I'm going to show you that is out of an organization called Gender Spectrum in San Francisco, and they work to support trans youth. In this model, we talk about gender in sort of a combination way. We talk about gender as biopsychosocial. So it has biological elements, psychological elements, social elements. So 3 different elements here. The first one is your body. So when we talk about our bodies and gender, we talk about things like our internal and external reproductive organs, our chromosomes, our hormone levels, and our brain matter. Those are all parts of our body, right? You'll notice here, though, on my little stick figure, that when I have the body section, it's pointing between this poor little stick figure's legs. And that is because usually when we're talking about the body section of gender, that's all anybody cares about, is your external reproductive organs. But that's not all there is to it. There's so much more going on, even just when we're talking about our bodies. The second part of gender here is your gender identity, which is your internal self-perception and experience of being female, male, both, or neither. So your internal experience of it. So it happens in your brain, right? So your internal experience. And now you might kind of go, hang on a second. These two things are already connected, right? Because if your gender identity is happening in your brain is part of your body, isn't it? Right? So your brain is also affected by things like hormone levels. That will change the way your brain functions and the way that it looks in MRIs. So these things are all interconnected. We kind of tease them out like pointing at specific threads in a weaving, but they're all very much connected. Third part here is your gender expression. So the way that you show your gender to others through clothing, hair, mannerisms, voice, etc., which have gendered values in your particular society. So it's going to be different in different places, different times. And you can also include gender roles in sort of this experience of gender expression. So to give you kind of an example with this little stick figure here, we've got identity pointing to the brain, right? And we've got body pointing to this little person's external reproductive organs. And then we've got expression, which would include things like, we've got this little person with kind of a little triangle body, which a lot of us know to read as a dress, even though it's not a dress, it's a triangle. This little person has kind of long, swoopy hair, and this person has a little bow. And so our brains look at this little stick person and we go, triangle body dress, little bow, long hair. That must mean it's a girl, right? That's what gender expression is looking at the sort of external things and kind of putting it all together and going, that's a boy or that's a girl. That's not always the case, but that's what our brains want to do, right? That's how our brains want to categorize things. So when we're looking at folks and our brains are trying to do that, we don't have to feel bad about the fact that that's what our brains automatically want to do, is to like categorize people. The reason our brains want to do that is because humans are sort of categorization machines. It's something that we've learned to do because it helps us make split-second decisions to see if something is dangerous or not dangerous. So if something is running at us, we have to go, our brains have to make a split-second decision to go, is that a tiger or is that my house cat? Am I in danger or is this a friend? Our brains want to do that, so we don't have to feel bad about the fact that our brains do that, but it does mean that we sometimes have to double-check our knee-jerk reactions, right? Just because we see a person with long hair and your brain goes, girl, doesn't mean that you can't go, now hang on a second, I know men who have long hair, or, you know, like we can kind of double check those reactions that we have. So we've got these 3 sections, body, gender identity, and gender expression. So you may sometimes hear the body part of this equation referred to as somebody's assigned sex, which is what I did earlier when I said I was assigned female at birth, right? Everybody kind of gets an assigned sex based on their an examination of their external genitalia, either before or at birth, right? We kind of, that's the it's a boy or it's a girl moment. And for a lot of people, that works. That system makes sense and it works, but not for everybody. So while most people are something called endosex, that's what most of us in this room are, meaning that we have sex characteristics that can be clearly assigned as either male or female, about 1.7% of the population is intersex, meaning that they have differences in sex development. So if you are an intersex person, you may have chromosomes that we would think of as either male or female. Like, for instance, you could have XY chromosomes, but your body might develop in ways that look to us as female. So your external and internal reproductive organs may develop in a way that we think of as female, even though you have XY chromosomes, because of something called androgen insensitivity. So your body it produces testosterone, but your body doesn't take that testosterone in. So that's just one way of being intersex. There are many, many different ways to be intersex. So when we think about, folks who say, well, it's just as easy as chromosomes. XX means female, XY means male. That's not true for everybody. About 1.7% of the population have these mixed characteristics. So, when we're talking about transgender folks, like myself, for instance, when we're using the word transgender, it's often seen as sort of an umbrella term for a whole bunch of different identities. So transgender has a lot that sort of falls within it. But they all have to do with having a gender identity that is different from the sex you were assigned at birth. That's like the basic definition, right? The word cisgender is used to refer to people who have a gender identity and assigned sex that match. So most of us in this room are probably cisgender. Trans and cis, those little prefixes, they're just Latin. Trans means across from, like transatlantic, or transfiguration today is a moving across from. Cis just means on the same side. So is your gender identity and your assigned sex, are they on the same side, or are they somewhat different from each other? That's what that prefix means. So that's sort of the general background for the word transgender. But like I said, there's lots of identities that fall under that umbrella. So for instance, you might be, like myself, a trans man who is somebody who is assigned female at birth but knows themselves to be male. You might be a transgender woman, somebody who is assigned male at birth but knows themselves to be female. Or you may be a non-binary person. So a non-binary person, binary of course just means two, right? Two options, like on, off, that's a binary option. If you are a non-binary person, you have a gender identity that doesn't conform to the male-female binary. So you may feel like a combination of male and female, or you may feel like a different gender altogether. So this is not, sometimes people who are kind of trying to engage in this conversation in bad faith will be like, well, can't I just identify as a giraffe? Can't I just identify as a car? That's not the same area here. We're talking specifically about gender, right? So understanding your gender as somebody who is non-binary may mean that you experience your gender as sort of neither male nor female, or sort of a combination of the two. Or it's a recognition that your gender identity just doesn't fit within this two-box system. So an example that I sometimes use, and this is a common example now, is we used to talk about gender as two boxes, right? You're filling out a form, you're either male or female, two-box system. And then we sort of started moving towards gender as a spectrum, right? So like, we've got male over here and female over here, and there's like a bunch of stuff in the middle. And that was good, because we're kind of like, now we can like understand that there might be people in the middle. But recognizing that we are three-dimensional people, right? We exist in 3D space. So how on earth would we think that we could perfectly describe ourselves on a two-dimensional scale, like a line, right, that goes between two boxes? People have been starting to talk about this idea of thinking about gender as less of a line and more of a constellation. So something like when we look up at the night sky and we see the Big Dipper, we kind of want to draw that line for the Big Dipper, right? And to us, we can go, oh, like there's a line between this star and this star, and we kind of see it that way. In reality, the two stars that we're drawing the line between might be way different from each other in terms of distance from each other, even though they look like they're in a line to us, right? The difference between 2D and 3-dimensional space. So the reason I bring that metaphor up is because for some non-binary folks, They say, look, I'm not male, I'm not female, I'm not right in the middle, I'm over here. And I may look like I'm in the middle to you, but I'm over here. My experience of gender does not fall on this line between male and female. So if that metaphor is helpful to you, take it. If you're like, that was way too much and I don't know what you're talking about, forget about it. Go with the line. That's fine. The line is better than two boxes, right? Because what we do with boxes is we want to kind of shoehorn people into boxes that don't fit. At least with a line, there's more space for people to move and be human. So take with that as you will. The last thing I'll say here on this slide is we sometimes use the phrase gender diversity to talk about sort of the diversity of gender that exists in the world when we're talking about groups, we're talking about cultures. We sometimes use the descriptor gender expansive to talk about people that fall outside of the gender norms in their society. So I would say, like, for instance, we're going to look at a person here. This person, Albert Cashier, I would describe him as a gender expansive person because I don't know exactly how they would identify. So I'm going to talk about Albert here in a second. If I was going to talk about a church and talk about like gender expansive people within the church, I would be talking about gender diversity within the church. So those are kind of just two words that you might hear me throw around, gender diversity and gender expansive. So when we're talking about gender diversity in human history, the reason I bring this up is because some people have this sense that like trans is a new thing, like this just popped out of nowhere, like why are we suddenly hearing and talking about trans people? Trans people and gender expansive people have existed throughout human history. As long as there have been people, there has been gender diversity. So I just wanted to give you a couple of examples of this. Albert Cashier here, who lived from 1843 to 1915, was a Union soldier in the Civil War who was assigned female at birth but lived as male for the last 53 years of his life. So Albert grew up in Ireland. He immigrated to the US. As soon as he immigrated, he started dressing and using gender expression to be male and to sort of express his male gender identity in culture. So everybody in his life in the US knew him as Albert, knew him as a man, even though he had not been known that way back in Ireland. When the Civil War started, he ended up joining the war and the war effort for the North, and was part of several decisive battles that decided the Civil War. So he's just one of the folks that we can kind of look back and point to, and I like looking back to him specifically because we have a picture of him. Sometimes it's just nice to have pictures of people to go, they're a real person, right? Mm-hmm. Another example, this is Hui Hua, who lived from 1849 to 1896. They were a Tlaxcala person from the Zuni people of New Mexico. So in Native American traditions all over North America, there are different tribes and nations that have an understanding of gender diversity, and it's like part of their culture. It's a normal thing. So for the Zuni people of New Mexico, they have men and women, and then they have Tlaxcala people who are not men or women, they're non-binary. And that's just part of their cultural understanding. Hui Hua was really important because she was one of the most famous weavers and potters in their culture. So her art is still saved by that people today. She was also the first gender expansive person to meet a US president. She met Grover Cleveland in 1886. So we know that gender expansive people have been around for a long time. There's of course ancient history of gender expansive people as well, but sometimes it's just nice to know, like, we've been here, we've been around, you can see these folks. When we're talking about gender diversity today, gender diversity looks like all kinds of things. These are all, so this would be gender diversity in the US, right? All of these folks are folks living in the US. Some of them are trans women, some are trans men, some are non-binary. So there are lots and lots of different ways to be trans. It doesn't look like one thing. And just because you're looking at somebody and you think you know what their gender is, you don't always know what their gender is. So that's a little bit to talk about what it means to be trans. I'm going to touch, like I said, very briefly on the second question. What does the Bible say? Because I grew up being told that the Bible said basically really terrible things about gay and lesbian folks, and nobody even talked about trans folks when I was growing up. Like, it just wasn't a thing. But now there are all kinds of folks from the denominations I grew up in who are like, the Bible says you can't be trans. So let's just talk about, we're going to talk about two verses that are sometimes used against trans folks, and talk about a little bit more of an expansive understanding. So, when we're talking about gender, this is usually the first thing that people go to is Genesis, right? The beginning, the creation, the beginning of humans. So God creates humans and says, let us make humankind in our image, according to our likeness. Let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the air, over the cattle, over all the wild animals of the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps upon the earth. So God created humankind in his image. In the image of God he created them. Male and female he created them, right? So this is a perfect example of somebody being able to look at the Bible and go, well, look, it's like the gender binary. It's divinely ordained. God says male or female. Male, it says male and female here in this text. So like, you kind of, what are you going to do with that, right? And there are lots of different ways to read this text, obviously. Even if one of the sort of first things that some folks might say, even without looking too closely, is that and, right? That it doesn't say male or female, it says male and female. So what if that means that every single person is made both male and female in some way? A possible option here, right, for this reading. But folks that really get into this text and look at what's going on in this text, point us back to the structure of the whole chapter of Genesis 1. So if you're familiar with Genesis 1, you know the whole story from being in Bible school probably, that God creates light and separates the light from the darkness, two things, and then God creates day and night, and then God creates the sun and the moon, and then God moves the water around, separates the water so you have land and sea, right? And God creates the fish of the sea and the birds of the air. So throughout the structure of Genesis 1, God is like separating things into twos pretty much all the way around. Once in a while God separates things into threes, but mostly it's separating things into twos. So it shouldn't be surprising that when we get to humans, God also separates things into two and says male and female, right? But just because God creates day and night like this, doesn't mean that this is actually how the world looks, right? That there's this sort of like distinct difference where the sun is up and it's day and then all of a sudden, bam, it's night. Where there's like this distinct like binary option of either day or night, right? What we actually get, this is just a time-lapse photo of a sunset, what we actually get is this huge spectrum of light, right? Where it goes from day to evening. And human beings have tried to make this into a two-box system. We tried to say like, okay, here's when the sun goes over the horizon, and here's when the first stars come out, and here's when, like we tried to create these sort of boundaries to say, this is day and this is night, but realistically we know that there's a lot of stuff going on in the middle here. The same thing can be said for the division between land and sea, right? We think, all right, well, there's land and there's sea, but there's also marshes and estuaries and coral reefs that are like land but in the sea. And there's like all of these weird things. There's beaches where the division between land and sea moves all the time. So there's more variation, even in these things that we think of as binaries, as a two-piece system. So when we kind of look at all of Genesis 1, we recognize that we would never say, dawn and dusk, this period that isn't day or night, that's evil. We wouldn't say penguins are evil because they're birds, but they live in the sea and they don't fly, and so therefore they don't fit Genesis 1, and so they're evil and God hates them. Like, we would never say that, right? So when we're looking at the rest of creation, we recognize not all of what was created fits into Genesis 1 perfectly, and that's not bad. That doesn't mean God didn't create them or God doesn't love them. It just means they're not within the poetry of Genesis 1. We can recognize that there's some middle space even between this. So there's lots more ways to think about Genesis 1, but I'm going to leave you with that one. Another common verse that is used against trans people happens in Deuteronomy 22:5, which says, "A woman shall not wear a man's apparel, nor shall a man put on a woman's garment, for whoever does such things is abhorrent to the Lord your God." So this is a classic verse, but it's like, okay, you've got to wear what you're supposed to wear when it comes to gender, period, that's it. And again, you could kind of say this is pretty cut and dried, but when we look into and ask some questions about this, it gets more complicated. For instance, what kind of garments are we talking about here? What kind of dress are we talking about here? Is this everyday clothing? Is this ceremonial clothing? Is this battle clothing? Because there's definitely some evidence that that's what this passage is talking about. So we have to take it in context, right? And there's several different kinds of clothing that this could be. Second of all, what do we do with the fact that there are people in the Bible who didn't seem to dress in the way that we would expect them to dress for their gender? So I want to give you a couple of examples. But before I give you that example, actually, I want to talk about the fact that Thomas Aquinas, when he was talking about this passage, if you're familiar with Thomas Aquinas, one of the church fathers, very important in Catholicism, he talked about this passage and he said, outward apparel should be consistent with the estate of the person, meaning their gender, according to the general custom. Hence, it is in itself sinful for a woman to wear man's clothes, or vice versa, especially since this may be the cause of sensuous pleasure. We hate pleasure. It's expressly forbidden in the law because the Gentiles used to practice this change of attire for the purpose of idolatrous superstition. Nevertheless, this may be done sometimes without sin on account of some necessity, either in order to hide oneself from enemies, or through lack of other clothes, or for some similar motive. So even Thomas Aquinas said there are loopholes. What Thomas Aquinas says here about the Gentiles using this to practice for idolatrous superstition, that's a very common theory for why this passage was written. That the people who lived around the people of Israel at the time were less strict in what dress was required, and when it came to worship of other gods, that there was more of there was less structure around it. You were allowed to, or even required to, dress in a way that was different from what was expected for your gender in order to worship these other gods. And so a common argument here is that this passage was written because everybody was worried about the slippery slope. If you start dressing like those people, you'll start worshiping their gods. Therefore, don't dress like them so you don't worship their gods. It's probable that that's the cause of this verse here. But even so, we recognize that there are some times when maybe this doesn't quite work out the way we want. This bit from Thomas Aquinas was actually used to defend Joan of Arc. If you remember the story of Joan of Arc, who dressed in men's clothes to fight the English in the 100 Years' War, I think it was. So Thomas Aquinas was cited to say Joan should be allowed to wear what she needed to wear to be fighting in that war. But it was unfortunately not enough to keep poor Joan alive. She was actually killed for the sin of cross-dressing. So when we talk about gender expression in the Bible and what we're wearing, it can be hard sometimes to find those people who wear clothes that maybe you wouldn't expect for their gender. And a lot of times it's hard because it's a translation issue. So I want to show you an example here. The story of Joseph, we all remember Joseph in the Technicolor dream coat, right? Joseph had this coat of many colors. So in Genesis 37 we read, Israel loved Joseph more than any other of his children because he was the son of his old age, and he made him a long robe with sleeves, is how it's translated in the NRSV. When his brothers saw their father loved him more than all his brothers, they hated him and could not speak peaceably to him. So in the NRSV, what Joseph is wearing is translated as long robe with sleeves. But in other translations, it's a coat with fringes, it's a coat of many colors. There's a lot of ways that we translate what Joseph is wearing here. The Hebrew for what Joseph is wearing is ketonet pasim. And we know what a ketonet is. It's kind of a robe, right? That's where we get the robe of many colors, or coat of many colors. So we know what a ketonet is. We don't really know what a ketonet pasim is. And so what you do with a language like Hebrew when you're looking at the Bible and you don't know what a word means, you look for other places in the Bible where that shows up so that you can kind of try to get some context, right? There's only one other place in the whole Bible where ketonet pasim is mentioned, and that's in 2 Samuel, to talk about King David's daughter Tamar. In 2 Samuel 13 we read, Tamar was wearing a ketonet pasim, a long robe with sleeves, for this is how the virgin daughters of the king were clothed in earlier times. So 2 Samuel says very specifically, this is a princess dress. What is Joseph doing wearing a princess dress? I love this photo because it's a dad and his son. His son really wanted an Elsa dress from Frozen, and the dad was like, absolutely, let's go get one. So this idea of people in the Bible who maybe were dressing in ways you wouldn't expect sometimes gets hidden by translation because we don't always know the historical type of clothing that these people were wearing and what it would have been normal for them to wear or not wear. So I like using Joseph as an example because it's one of those things that's kind of hidden in the text. And when you do a Bible study on the story of Joseph, for instance, with transgender expansive people, you get some really interesting insights. For instance, oh, so you're telling me Joseph was assigned male but dressed in a more feminine way, and his brothers all beat him up all the time. Sounds about right. Like, there's a lot that goes on here when you start looking at the experiences of these people in Scripture that resonates with folks today when you start getting into it like this. So, I'm going to stop there with the Bible stuff because I wrote a whole book about it, and if you want to read more, you can. I brought some with me if you want one, so don't forget to remind me if you want one afterwards. So the last question I was asking was, will I be able to find a faith community? Will I be able to find a place where I can be myself and be loved for who I was? And the answer, I'm going to give it to you right away, was yes. I am now part of a church called Humble Walk that meets in St. Paul down on West 7th Street. And when I first started my medical transition, after I came out, after I graduated from seminary, and I started my medical transition, which include things like taking hormone replacement therapy, I would go to Humble Walk on Sundays, and they have this great practice at the end of services where they have a little jar of stones and then another glass jar, and they'll say, does anybody have any milestones they want to share? And people will come up and they'll take a little stone out of one and they'll say, here's my milestone, and they'll put it in the jar. And then at the end of the year, we have this nice jar of everybody's milestones. It's really nice. So people would come up to just announce stuff that was going on in their life. Like little kids would come up and say, I lost a tooth, or somebody would come up and say, it's my birthday, or whatever. So I would come up week after week, and I would say things like, I started hormone therapy today, and everybody would go, yay! Or like I'd come up and I'd say like, I came out to my parents today, yay! And like having that kind of like affirmation was huge during that part of my transition. So when I legally changed my name, took about a year to get that whole process done. They made me a cake. They baked me a cake with my new name on it, and we all had a little party outside after the service, and it was so sweet. And this is just a fragment from a prayer from, they did a little celebration of baptism and name change ceremony within one of the services. It was really sweet. So it says, O God, in renaming your servants Abraham, Sarah, Jacob, Peter, and Paul, you gave them new lives and new tasks, new love and new hope. We now hold before you our sibling Austen. Bless him with a new measure of grace as he takes his new name. Write him again in your heart and on your palm, and grant that we also may take on the name of our brother Christ, whose name is love, and in whom with you and the Spirit we pray. So it was just an incredibly supportive community to come out in and to be able to be myself in, and I'm really, really grateful for them. So I want to talk about some of the things that they did that were so supportive and so helpful to me. One of the things they did was recognizing my name and using my right name and pronouns, right? So I want to talk about why names and pronouns matter. Using somebody's correct pronouns means that you're treating them as you want to be treated, as you would want to be treated. You show them that you see them, respect them, and you want to know them, right? Using somebody's right name and pronouns is the difference between somebody talking to you and somebody talking to somebody behind you. So often if you use the wrong name or pronouns for somebody, it feels like if somebody uses the wrong name or pronouns for me, it feels like they must be talking to somebody else. They're not really talking to me. They don't really want to know me. They are more committed to their idea of who I am than who I actually am, right? So, just a quick two statistics that I think are helpful as we think about this. A 2018 study by the University of Texas at Austen found that transgender youth ages 15 to 21 who had their chosen name used at school, work, home, and with friends had 71% fewer symptoms of severe depression, a 34% decrease in reported thoughts of suicide, and a 65% decrease in suicide attempts. having even one context in which a chosen name could be used was associated with a 29% decrease in suicidal thoughts. So you've got these 4 contexts, right? And if your right name and pronouns too are used in even one of those 4 contexts, a 29% decrease in suicidal thoughts, right? So the 4 contexts they have in this study were school, work, home, and with friends. But it is so easy for us to go, what if church is a 5th context? What if church is one of these places? What if the church is the only place where the person who is standing in front of you, who just wants to be seen, gets to be seen? That is huge. Maybe it's only once a week, but that is huge. So thinking about how we can be part of this contextual change for people. A 2016 study in the Journal of the American Academy of Pediatrics showed that trans youth who were supported by their parents and allowed to socially transition had the same risk for depression as their cisgender peers and had only a 2 to 4% higher risk for anxiety. The reason that this statistic is important is because it shows that even though there is a higher level of depression and anxiety and risk for suicide within trans communities, it's not inherent to being trans. It's not that there is something wrong with you that makes you have these negative mental health outcomes. It's the fact that you're living in a society that wasn't built for you. It wasn't, you're living in a society where you kind of have to be swimming upstream all the time. When you're supported and you no longer have to do that, youth have basically the same mental health outcomes as everybody else, as long as they're supported. The biggest factor in youth well-being for trans youth is parental support, and the biggest factor in religious families of parental support is whether or not the faith community they are involved in is affirming. So affirming churches mean affirming families, mean healthy youth. It's like a distinct line through the whole way, which is why this is so important. So when we're talking about pronouns, if people are like, pronouns, and you're like, what? Pronouns just replace nouns when we're referring to somebody in the 3rd person, right? So she loves armadillos, his shoelaces are untied. When you're referring to somebody in the 3rd person, you're using their gender pronouns. So many languages have gender-neutral pronouns, like German. They have male, female, and then neuter or neutral pronouns. But English doesn't have one that everybody kind of knows about in the same way. We tend to use he and she. It's not quite like Spanish, for instance, where like even objects have a gender. Mostly only people have gender in English. But we have this problem where people are always gendered he or she, and we don't have an obvious fix for that. And so one of the ways that people have started finding some gender neutral language in gender pronouns is by using they and them and theirs as a gender neutral 3rd option for pronouns. So if you're somebody who's like, now hang on, they and them, that's plural, like that's for a group of people, right? True, but we've actually been using they and them as a singular pronoun for a lot longer without even realizing that we're doing it. So just a couple examples of seeing this. In Chaucer, in the Canterbury Tales, right, one of the first written documents we talk about in English class, this is in Old English, right, so you're gonna have to bear with my Old English here. Whoso findeth him out of switch blame, they will come up. It's part of just a description of a character in the Canterbury Tales, using they as a singular to talk about one specific person without using in gender. Same thing happens in Comedy of Errors in Shakespeare. There's not a man I meet, but doth salute me as if I were their well-acquainted friend. So you can see he's saying there's not a man I met, so there's gender in the first part there, but as if I were their well-acquainted friend, you would assume that it would be as if I were his well-acquainted friend because of the man in the first part. But Shakespeare is intentionally using this 3rd person gender-neutral pronoun to expand it to be people of all different genders. So there's a lot going on there English-wise, because man didn't only mean men sometimes in Shakespeare's time either. But there's an example of using there as a singular pronoun. Same thing with Jane Austen in Mansfield Park. Had the doctor been contented to take my dining tables, as anybody in their senses would have done, talking about this doctor who wouldn't follow instructions. Anybody in their senses, right? So we're talking about the doctor, we're only talking about one person, but when you're expanding it, when you're talking about a gender neutral option, you can use they and them and their in a way that actually makes a lot of sense. Sometimes there's like some contextual stuff you have to do if you're talking to figure out if you're talking about one person or multiple people, but most of the time it's pretty easy. If you're like, I don't want to do that, I hate that, why don't we just have other options? We do actually have other options for other pronouns that people use. So there are other pronouns that people use, like sie and zir, or they and them. So it's kind of like, would you rather use something that you already know how to do and just edit it a little bit, or would you rather use something completely new? You're going to have to learn something new regardless. That's just part of being human. We've got to learn new stuff to love our neighbors, right? People that we maybe have not met before. But I want to use the they-them example to just kind of show you how this would work in some sentences here. So using they-them as a pronoun for these sentences, for instance, did you take Amanda's toy? They need that back. That'd be a singular use there. I'm looking for Jess. Have you seen them? I wish I could go to the dance with Sabine. They are so cool. Tyrone wants to do it themselves. Oh no, Taylor forgot their hat. So this is the way that you would use they as a singular pronoun. So more and more folks are using they, them as singular pronouns, and it's something that can be hard for us to kind of get our brains around because it's new for us, right? The way that you learn a new thing is by saying it with your mouth, which it feels kind of weird to do, right? This is why we tell little kids when they're doing flashcards that they should say their flashcards out loud, because if you want to create a new neural pathway in your brain to learn a new thing, you have to do it with your body so that your body gets used to it. So if you meet somebody and they tell you, like, my pronouns are they, them, or my pronouns are ze, zir, for instance, and you're like, I don't know how to do that, practice is the key. So if you meet somebody and you're trying to, like, this is a person that you're going to have like a relationship with, you're going to know them, practice in your car, practice when you're in the shower. Just say sentences like this to practice using those new pronouns. The more you practice it, the easier it gets, and then pretty soon you're not even thinking about it anymore. It's just a new thing that you have to build up that muscle memory in your brain. But like I said, the reason that this is important is because it shows people that they are seen and known and loved, and it changes communities, it changes families to create a healthier, safer space, especially for our youth. So the last thing I will say here, and then we'll have a little bit of time for some questions, is another thing that my church did was think about using gender-inclusive language. So there's lots of different ways that you can use gender-inclusive language. You can use it in language about God, right? When we're talking about God, how does our gendered language in reference to God affect how we know God, and how does our language in liturgy reflect that? So there's been kind of a movement, especially in like a lot of ELCA churches that I have been a part of, away from using just he, him for God all the time, and just kind of using God as like without pronouns, right? And that has been kind of a movement to recognize God is not a boy, right? God is beyond gender, or God encompasses all genders, depending on how you want to think about it. But recognizing that God is just not an old white guy in the sky with a beard, one of the ways we can do that is by using more expansive language. So whether that means using some feminine language for God sometimes, maybe that's not something that you are comfortable with, and that's okay too, but like thinking critically about the gendered language we use for God. So not using these things, like we're going to use Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, it's classic, of course we are, but also thinking about some other gendered ways or non-gendered ways to talk about God, like creator, redeemer, sustainer, right? Also a classic way, Augustine used that. And it's not as gendered, and so it helps us remember that God is not a boy, God is not a man, right? And so that helps us not only in our relationship with God, but also when we think about humans as being created in the image of God. If we think about God as male, then we think about male as the best thing to be created in the image of. So it really gets into our theology in a deep way. So thinking about more expansive ways of talking about God. In our language about community, does the gendered language we use to refer to others in our community actually reflect the diversity in the pews, in the pulpit, and in our Sunday school? So you may have noticed this morning, actually, the bishop, when she was talking about people, she said siblings, our siblings in Christ. And that is a classic way of getting around something like brothers and sisters in Christ, right? So I'm not, again, saying never say brothers and sisters, right? But remembering that when we're talking to our community, there may be non-binary people in our community who aren't included when we say brothers and sisters. So you can just add siblings on the end if you want and say brothers and sisters and siblings, that's fine. But remembering that if we don't include people in our language, they won't feel comfortable in being involved and taking action and getting to know people, because they'll feel like, oh, I'm not actually supposed to be here. Oh, shoot. So we want to make sure that we're calling people what they want to be called and including them in our community language. Organizing in music, this is something we do all the time, where we'll do like men sing stanza 1, women sing stanza 2, things like that. Thinking about that when we're talking about, again, our community, and again, like we're not singing together quite yet, but when singing together returns, thinking about how we do that. So maybe instead of doing men and women, you can split into high voices and low voices. And that's a lot easier. I'll tell you myself, when my voice was changing at 24 years old, it was really helpful to think, all right, well, today I'm going to sing with the high voices. We'll see how that goes. Tomorrow I'll try to sing with the low voices, see how that goes. Thinking about how we gender even those groups during singing. And then sometimes we even need to rethink some of the ways that our hymns are written. So this is an example in the Chalice hymnal. They changed just a couple of lines in Be Thou My Vision. In the original Be Thou My Vision, it was Thou my great Father and I thy true Son. And folks realized a couple of decades ago that they were like, this feels weird if I'm a woman singing about how I'm thy true son. Can we change this? And so they changed it to Thou my Redeemer, my love thou hast won, which is actually about as common as the original version now if you go look at a hymnal. So there are times when we kind of go, you know what? This language does not make sense for who is singing the song and for the community that is singing it. And there's a lot of complex stuff going on there with rhyme and rhythm and things. If you're a music person, it's not always easy to change this stuff. But just being aware of it is the first step, to be aware of, like, what are we asking people to sing about themselves. So this last slide is just sort of fun and inspirational to me, thinking about the fact that there are lots of trans and gender expansive people in ministry. This is not just about people in the pews, this is also about folks in our own churches in leadership. So let me think here. Nicole Garcia is in the ELCA. Lawrence is in UCC, that's right. So I know we have at least, off the top of my head, I know at least 5 trans pastors in the ELCA that are currently pastoring, and there are probably more, but I only know about 5 of them at the moment. But these are folks that are out there and preaching and pastoring and doing good stuff, and so this is not we want to remember that this is not a glass ceiling situation, that these are just people in the pews. These are people who are leading as well. All right, last slide. Top 7 affirming actions for churches, things that you can think about doing. Number 1, including trans and gender expansive people in church leadership, right? Whether that means like on a committee or in any sort of like decision-making position, because we have a lot to bring, and it's important that we not have that weird glass ceiling thing going on. Educating leaders and greeters, and having trans leaders and greeters. When I say leaders and greeters, I mean like make sure that your folks who are working with youth, for instance, know about gender diversity, because you'll probably, that's something that's going to come up in communities. Make sure that when you have greeters that are greeting people at the front door, that they're not making assumptions based on gender stereotypes when they're welcoming folks, because if you get misgendered at the door, you're less likely to come back. Creating gender-inclusive facilities, so things like bathrooms. Any single-stall bathroom can be a gender-neutral bathroom. You don't even have to do anything except change the sign. Using inclusive language, having a welcoming statement and non-discrimination policy, redistributing resources to trans people through donations and partnerships with local support orgs. So there are lots of trans organizations that you can partner with as a church. Regularly including resources in theology related to gender diversity in preaching, Bible studies, youth curriculum, etc. So there's lots of ways to do that as well. So if you want to learn more about all of this stuff, if you are curious and want to learn more about what's going on here, like I said, I have this organization called Transmission Ministry Collective, and we have a couple of resource spots to go to. We especially, if you're familiar with bookshop.org, it's like an alternative to Amazon that helps small bookstores. But if you go to bookshop.org/shop/transmission ministry, we have all these recommended lists, like for parents, for pastors, for trans people exploring their gender. So go to that link and you'll find a whole bunch of recommended books. And then you can also contact me at any of these places. And if you're like, I don't remember any of that, ask Esther and she'll pass you on to me, and that'll be easy. So that's where we're going to stop, and I think the best thing to do here, because we're almost at 45, is we'll just call stop now, but if you have more questions and you want to come up and talk to me, I'm here to chill out for another few minutes. So we'll just do that. So thank you so much for being here today, everybody.